Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Orthodox Christian Studies Center Summer Edition, where we're doing John Zizioulas's book, Remembering the Future, here with Jack Pappas and with Rachel Contes, whom all of you know by now. This is our last session. All the previous three have been recorded, and this one will be recorded and they're sent out to the registrants, but they'll also be dropped on YouTube pretty soon, all four at once. So, yeah, I mean, it's been a really good time. I mean, so I should mention that today is the feast day of the Transfiguration, a really big feast day in the Orthodox Church, and I think it's perfect that we're kind of talking about all this on this last chapter, these last two chapters on the feast day of the Resurrection. Sorry, of the Transfiguration. Sorry about that. That was maybe a Freudian slip, but
It
Zizioulas doesn't.
counts from a psychological viewpoint.
Yeah, Zizioulas doesn't like psychology, so we can maybe we can't do that. Anyway, so yeah, so the feast day of the Transfiguration, and we're talking about eschaton and hell and transfiguration and all kinds of things. I mean, the feast day of the Transfiguration is interpreted by many fathers as a feast day that is really it's not just a miracle, but it's really about what who Jesus is, but also what Jesus makes possible for human beings, right? The transfiguration of the world of materiality, of creation, and union with God. Rowan Williams has this small little book somewhere back there in one of my other shelves on the icon of the transfiguration, which I recommend to all of you. And he has this great line where he says that God's creation or creation itself is shot through with the presence of God. And somehow the Feast of the Transfiguration speaks to that. So I think it's very appropriate that we're talking about the eschaton. Zizioulas' last book on the Feast of the Transfiguration. So happy feast, everybody. So we're going to talk about hell and then like eschaton, Eucharist, and um, all that stuff. And we're going to, again, each approach has been a little bit different every time. And we're going to change it up again this time. We're going to walk through the hell chapter, which is, uh, uh, no pun intended, maybe a bit hellish. Um, so,
Womp, womp, womp.
sorry, I couldn't resist. Um, and it's the shortest chapter in the book. Um, and I'm not going to give sort of the bullet point overview. I mean, the only thing I really will want to say is, as an overview, is that what Zizioulas is trying to do is sort of fight against what he's talking about what's called a more juridical understanding of hell. And the juridical understanding of hell is quite simply probably the most common understanding of hell, where, you do something right, you go to a place called heaven, you do something wrong, and you go to a place called hell. And, you're kind of judged on this right and wrong kind of thing. It's kind of another way to put it is a kind of a legalistic way of seeing salvation. And Zizioulas is clearly trying to offer an ontological interpretation of hell. Ontological, that has something to do with relational ontology, with remembering the future, with all the things that we've talked about up to now. So that's kind of the simple framework, right? He's fighting against this legalistic way of seeing Christianity, right? This, more, again, this more common way of seeing Christianity. Like most people, in fact, with my own students, I think Jack and Rachel would agree, they don't only see Christianity in this legalistic way, they see all religion in this way. All religion is just kind of, you do the right thing, you go to a good place, you go to a bad thing, you go to a. So one of the virtues of what Zizioulas is trying to do is get us to think differently about Christianity, about the incarnation. And in that sense, I think he's right, right? And in that sense, I also think he's right to try to give us a different way. based on this relational ontology, which I think he's onto something. He's trying to give us a different way of seeing, of maybe thinking about hell. Um, the question is, this is in my mind, and I've read most of whatever Zizioulas has written. In my mind, I think this is the first time that he's really trying to talk about hell. Um, Not the eschaton, but specifically hell. So I think this chapter is more exploratory, quite honestly. That's how I read it.
It
And
gives that impression for sure. Yeah.
yeah, it's more exploratory. And I think what we're going to do is talk about some things where, we're going to just raise some questions in such a way that maybe we're going to keep thinking along with him. Let's put it that way, right? We're going to kind of keep thinking along. We're going to keep exploring with him based on his relational ontology. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So based on his relational ontology, we're gonna try to keep thinking, keep Zizioulas's exploration going, in other words, in his absence, but hopefully based on his own principles. I do want to mention though, before I forget, because I mentioned it last time, but I want to mention it before I forget that this book, it's kind of interesting. This book is again is his only second monograph, and it's about the eschaton, it's about remembering the future, and so on and so forth. And as I said last time too, a PhD student from Greece was saying this and mentioned to me that you know one could start here with this book and then go back to some of the other things that he's done in 74 and being as communion and other things. Um, but again, it was also mentioned that by the student, but that it's kind of like form and content going together in a way, because for Zizioulas, it's kind of remembering the future, right? And so this is kind of his last work. It's almost like his eschatological work in a way. So in a way, it's kind of um, by beginning with where he ends, to some extent, everything he said prior to that becomes clear. And that's exactly what he's talking the eschaton does. Um, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that before we go on. So, but we're gonna take this little piecemeal. I think it's gonna be a little bit disjointed, maybe, but hopefully, what we communicate will be somewhat clear. Raise some questions, but let's focus on the hell chapter and beginning on 217. I'm gonna start. And again, I mean, the basic thing that he's trying to do here is talk about how he wants to give us a new interpretation, one that's different from the juridical or legalistic, or what he's calling the psychological, which I'm not 100% sure what he means by that, but maybe we can explore that. But he begins in a way that initially, I have to be honest, he begins in a way that talks about what is the resurrection. And obviously, the resurrection is ever being, but then he starts adding a little bit more detail. And on page 220, and especially on page 222, well, 220, 221, and 222, at the bottom of 220, he talks about, and he quotes Maximus here, like putting away the memories of evil. And then he has a kind of a footnote on footnote 11, where he sort of reinforces that, like that the resurrection is something about the eschaton is not about remembering our sins. And then on page 222, he kind of talks about it again, where he talks um, about how evil will not exist even as a memory in the sinner's soul, which at the eschaton will shed the memories of evil stored up in it. This is a rejection of the psychological interpretation of hell as a survival of the consciousness of evil deeds. I guess that's what he means by the psychological interpretation. For St. Maximus, as for the Father's evil has no hypostasis, no ontological content, and consequently cannot survive at the eschaton even as a memory. The eschaton is a survival of being, not non-being, which is what evil is. Okay. So that's what I'm going to start there. So there you see kind of he's grappling with the ontological interpretation, trying to apply it to understanding of evil, and then trying to understanding of hell. I'm not sure I agree that whatever the resurrection is, that somehow it's this state of being in which evil is not remembered. Um, and one of the reasons why I say that is because, and maybe we could talk about this more as we go along, but one of the reasons why I want to say that is that because um, forgiveness has to be part of the equation of the resurrection. It has to be part of the equation of the eschaton, right? And if we think about forgiveness, and he talks about forgiveness a little bit later, but if we think about forgiveness, forgiveness is not, cannot be, simply cannot be an erasure of the evil deed. So, as a simple example, right? If and I've never done this, it's just a hypothetical. Honestly, it is. It's just a hypothetical. But if I get drunk and, hit a teenager riding their bike on the road, and yet later I repent, obviously, but yet the parents of this child also receive that repentance. In other words, they honestly and truly forgive. And there are true stories like that. There are. Then my relationship with the parents, which could become very intimate, actually, even after something like that, because there are real stories like that in the world. There's absolutely no way that that relationship is a non-remembrance of what happened. And it's a remembrance in a different way. It's a new memory, perhaps something new emerges out of it. I would have preferred, I think, if he said something like, evil doesn't have the final say. Evil isn't decisive. In that sense, evil has no being. It's not really decisive in that way. Because if it was decisive, it would have being to it. But to kind of frame it in terms of memory and memory as kind of erasure, um, yeah, I don't think that's the best way to put it. So, Rachel, Jack, does that make sense? What I'm trying to
Yeah.
communicate, and any thoughts on that? I mean, so I'm just again, we're just
Mm,
trying to think along with him and maybe think about it's giving us something to think about, maybe figure out ways that we can kind of talk about it a little bit differently.
So I think kind of in the spirit of going along with him, the question I wanted to ask is, I mean, and this is directed at you, Telly, but Rachel too. What is the gain? I mean, so if we're thinking about it from like the other perspective, right?
Yeah.
What is the advantage, to put it kind of crudely, maybe, of emphasizing the idea of forgetting as constitutive of reconciliation? Because I mean,
Non-being.
there's a,
Well, not he's trying to frame it as non-being because he thinks memory keeps evil as being, right? If you remember it,
yeah,
it still has being, it still has existence, it has ever being.
if
But
it's remembered.
yeah, but forgiveness is not it's not so, quite as simple as, the bad deed, not giving. I mean, if we forgive, we're relating to the bad deed in a different way. I mean, even you can bring in a relational ontology.
It's a relation, yeah.
Right. Like it's how you
Right.
relate to the bad deed, how you relate to the bad memory, so even then,
But isn't it,
I just think there's maybe a different way he's so kind of caught between this being, non-being
yeah. And
dialectic that it has to be this either or for him.
I agree with you. I guess my question would be, would this be changed at all if we took him as saying that after forgiveness, there is forgetting?
But
But wouldn't it?
I think he is saying
He is
that.
saying that.
And I think he's wrong. It's because in common human experience, there is no forgetting.
Well, so it isn't then about saying that you have to remember in order to forgive. It seems like
No,
that would
no,
be
no,
included here. The
no. I'm not.
question becomes this kind of annihilation of history and memory after forgiveness, as though
Yeah.
so it seems like, right, to your point, the gain would be,
Mhm.
well, now that there is reconciliation, now that there's forgiveness, the past can't have any kind of reality, even if it's just the trace of what had happened before the reconciliation and the judgment of wrong done.
Yeah.
But I think to your point, and I agree with you. I think what is at least it, problematic here for me is the idea that if on the other side of forgiveness, history is forgotten, then why what was is history just lost? Is the past just lost? It seems like in order for forgiveness to actually be efficacious, right? There would have to be memory in some way, but memory in a different way, maybe. Or,
Yeah.
memory of the wrong done through the prism of the forgiveness that has overcome it. I don't know. I think I'm really posing these questions not to undermine your point, but to understand what he thinks the actual net gain is of emphasizing this forgetting of the past.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
it's not totally,
It sounds like for him, what he's talking about in this section is this because he's so like insistent on memory
Yeah.
being part or like the ever remembering being part of the psychological view. When he says we don't want the psychological view, he throws it out and doesn't think about and then doesn't return to what the keeping of memory might do in the ontological view. He just completely pairs the keeping of memory of sin with the psychological, which I understand why he
mm,
does that. But I think the question we're trying to ask is constructively, what happens if you take away the psychological view and keep the some of the memory or what to me what I find what I might have found helpful is just a new category, right? Like something imaginative around what like around like what is it? He talks so much about Christ in the days after the resurrection, but doesn't talk about the wounds. He doesn't talk
right.
about the in the body. He doesn't talk about like Christ's post-resurrection, pre-ascension ministry in any way, which do deal with both a memory and ascending out. Um, and I wonder what that could give to this as like a new space or a new thing that exists between just remembering and forgetting. Um,
Yeah.
and like for me, I think that when I worked with people who have experienced homelessness. I worked with people who have I worked very closely with a man who had murdered someone. Actually, I worked with two people who had murdered folks while working on a campaign to make it illegal to discriminate for housing on the basis of a criminal record. So for folks who maybe don't know, I was a did community organizing before doing this. So this one guy, Rich, had just straight up murdered a black man because he was part of the KKK. and in prison renounced the KKK and got shot for it and got almost murdered and ended up working with the family of the man that he murdered to do anti-racist work. And if you asked Rich, like, dude, why do you keep your tattoo of your swastika on? Like you're doing anti-racist work. He said, I don't deserve to have it off my body. And you would talk, I met the parents of this man. And, if you ask them why, like, don't you want Rich to just be upset forever, right? Because these are always the examples people use when you talk about any kind of forgiveness. They're like, what about the person who killed your kid? Well, this guy did kill someone's kid, right? And the parents would just say, like, I just think I'll have a new question when I get there and I'm with my son. And I think the insight of, I think I might have a new question is an insight that could be taken seriously here in light of the fact that I think we all wish that any silver lining of this young man dying and being murdered didn't happen because we wish life was preserved. But it did, and forgiveness has happened, and anti-racist work has happened, and somewhere in the eschaton, right? Something new may happen because Christ was resurrected and still has the wounds. you know like what does that mean? And I think that there's just not enough of it's so jettisoned, memory is so jettisoned with the psychological view that the actual like view of the create Sonia, what is Dr.
Montiero.
Montero, like
Montero.
her creation out of nothing, forgiveness creation out of nothing, I think is a good way of thinking about this. And that comes she got this idea that creation that forgiveness is an act of creation out of nothing from Zizioulas, and then he himself doesn't make it there. So I just think he needs, because he has to create dichotomies.
Yeah.
I think the in between is actually where this could be more interesting. Also, I saw we have a question, so I'm sorry that to not have seen that to all these points.
Yeah, I mean, the question is to all these, how does this work with Zizioulas' overall approach to the eschaton, at least in this book, as the erasure, annihilation, evil, wrong, and death? I mean, I think, um, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think one of the reasons why he's saying that, I mean, he's framing the eschaton ontologically. He's framing the eschaton, especially in terms of the resurrection, as being versus non-being. Evil has always been associated with non-being in the sense that it's something that drains being. It's something that doesn't really sort of contribute to it, right? It takes away from. It's a diminution of. Um, but as a diminution of it, it's not really being itself. And from that point of view, then from there he goes and says that if that's the case, then resurrection really has to be about erasure of the memories of evil, because if you have a memory of evil, it's like keeping it alive. It's like keeping it in being. And I'm trying to hold on to the eschatological, ontological thing and all that, but maybe offer a different way of framing it, of putting it, that there can be a memory of evil that through forgiveness is a transformed memory, but there's still a judgment that that was evil, right? So it's not like you're remembering only the forgiveness part, because if you're remembering the forgiveness part, you have to remember the thing that you're judging needed to be forgiven. So I guess I think what I'm trying to argue is that within his own framework, I hope this is answering the question. Within his own framework, I think there might be a little bit a more relational way of understanding it that I think makes a little bit more sense. I don't think saying that we have to erase memories of evil is coherent, quite honestly. I think that's the best word with what
Yeah.
he's doing, because I just think
Yeah.
that relationally, forgiveness is a relational event that involves memory. It has to involve memory.
Past. Yeah.
Has to, yeah. And especially with the fact that later in the chapter, especially in the last chapter, he's talking about the fact that time is part of eternity, right? So that's a really interesting point, what he's trying to do there. And that not to set up this opposition between eternity and time, but that time itself is itself movement, and that whatever eternity is, it's a remembrance of historical events. But then he thinks he's being consistent by saying, but somehow there's this weeding out process. Like it's only going to remember the good events and the bad events it's going to kind of put to the side. And I just don't think that makes any, I just don't think that's coherent, right? It's got to also include the bad events, and it's also got to, in some ways, remember those bad events in such a way that there is a process. I don't know how, I don't know when, but somehow whatever is happening in the eschaton, that there is a process of reconciliation. There's a process of forgiveness. There's a process in which those memories aren't simply that this evil thing was bad and did all this bad stuff. In other words, it's a memory. The memory is that the evil is not decisive. That to me is key. And in not being decisive, it still has no being. But you can't pretend it didn't happen. Or you can't live in a state of being where somehow it's like I don't mean to be flip about this, but it's like watching one of those sci-fi shows like in the United States called Star Trek, and having like sort of the memory erasure gadget go over your head or something like that. And I just don't think that I don't think that's what the eschaton is. It can't be that, because even in living human experience, when there's actual real forgiveness, then you're not really erasing the memory. You're actually building upon the memory in a new way. Whatever emerges,
Yeah.
and Rachel's referring to a dissertation that was done by a Fordham student, Sonia Matero, and whatever is emerging in that relationship is through that event, not by negating the event. And that's, now to get a little bit nerdy, that's what makes Christianity a little bit different than the Hegelian dialectic. Would you
Mm.
would you agree, Jack?
I have to think about that. Um, I want to.
Through. It's through, not negate, not
It's
negating. Yeah.
yeah. I think the distinction in any case between the negation of the past versus the redeeming of the past is is the right distinction to make here. And I think it is kind of interesting that um on the one hand, and I think this gets to your point about there's a basic incoherence to put uh to kind of put it that way in this chapter where with respect to memory, he wants to say that no, all of the wounds of history, right?
Right.
All sin has to be negated in order for there to be redemption or salvation. But on the other hand, it's kind of interesting because by negating the past, it seems as though history there is a part of history, a through line of history that is unredeemed, that just has to be forgotten,
Yeah, that's what it
right?
sounds like. So maybe we're not reading him correctly, but that's what that's what it sounds like he's saying.
Because for something to be redeemed, it has to, in some sense, as you put it, it has to be worked through. It has to be, and even if it's already worked through, if
Yeah.
it's already forgiven, if it's already judged, if there's already reconciliation,
Yeah.
that judgment, that reconciliation, that forgiveness, that grace is only legible in light of the past that required it to have been enacted at all.
Yeah.
Because what seems to be here now, I mean, if you want to, I think you could read Hegel in one of two directions, but that's a different conversation. I think that if you want to say that history is the ladder that gets kicked away once you get to heaven, that doesn't sound a lot like redemption. That sounds a lot like the negation of history. You can have reconciliation without the persistence of you know, the committed sin.
Yeah.
But the committed sin is in some sense the background in which the act of forgiveness is, even if it's radically new, even if it's unconditional, even if it's absolute and total, in order for that act of forgiveness to be an act of redeeming, it has
Hmm.
to in some sense be understood in relation to what is being redeemed, what we are being redeemed from. And I think what's kind of interesting is in the rest of the chapter, he insists over and over again at qualifying the totality, the comprehensiveness of this reconciliation. By insisting on the eternity of hell and so on. But with respect to memory, maybe because it's psychological, I'm not really sure what to make of that line of criticism in this text. Um, Memory is the exception. Memory, we can negate all memory of sin and evil, but the reality, the persistence of punishment, in some sense, is not something he's willing to let go of. So there's a basic tension here. Um, I don't know, which either underlines the exploratory nature of this chapter or certain limitations in the way he applies his own kind of principles.
Okay, so look, I mean, let's go on. I mean, so we've raised enough questions about this point. The only other thing I want to do, because then I'm going to hand it off to you guys. The only thing I want to basically say is this, is that I'm from pages on Hell and Freedom on page 223, 224, 225. I mean, he's really, really struggling here. Struggling maybe is a strong word. He's exploring. He's really exploring um, what it really means to think about someone in hell. And
Hmm.
he definitely wants to get away from the really punitive fire
Yeah,
and brimstone stuff, but he doesn't want to deny that there's a hell. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Jack, you're going to bring some of that up too, in terms of
yeah,
just how he accuses some people of denying that there's a hell and stuff like that. So you'll talk about that. But he uses this distinction in Maximus the Confessor, and we don't have to talk about this a lot. I just want to flag it. He uses his distinction in Maximus the Confessor about how um, the difference between knowledge and participation. And you can have knowledge of the good, but what's real for Maximus is not simply knowing, but participation. And so he basically says people in hell have a knowledge of the good, but they're not really participating in the good. Now, the only thing I want to flag is that when Maximus talks about that, he does not apply it to hell. He's talking about living human beings on earth. And he's talking about people who, in their head, know what's right, what's good, and that kind of stuff, but can't either bring themselves to do it or aren't participating in it or aren't living it, participating in it. You know what I'm saying? Aren't kind of embodying it, aren't exuding it, aren't living it, aren't you see what I'm trying to say? And there is a difference between knowing something and experiencing it. On a more negative side of things, it's one thing to read about war, it's an other to live in the conditions that so many people around the world live in, but especially the people of Gaza today. It's one thing to cognitively know about that. It's one thing to be submerged in it. But the same can also be for the good, right? It's one thing to hear it and to agree with it or to reason about it. It's another thing to be submerged in it. Um, so I just I don't think I don't think using that distinction and applying it to like the heaven hell distinction, I don't think that makes sense.
Hmm.
But anyway, we don't have to talk about that. I just want to flag it. Jack, why don't you take over? We do have a question by Barbara about is everyone saved? I think this is something you're gonna.
I think we'll get to
I
that
think
for
we're gonna
sure.
get to
Yeah, we're
that,
gonna
but
get
Yeah,
to
maybe we
Yeah,
should
Barbara. We're gonna get to that.
talk
So,
about Masha's question.
yeah, that's a good point to touch on Masha's question, I think.
all right, Jack. So,
Well, so Masha brings up, don't you think what Zizioulas, I think this is kind of directed to you, Telly. don't you think what Zizioulas is trying to say is that evil, sorry,
Can you see me?
no, yeah, sorry, I just cut out for a second.
Mm.
Um, don't you think what Zizioulas is trying to say is that evil in history acquires a primary didactic role, like a sort of interference in the signal of good? And as such, it is lifted in the eschaton because it is no longer necessary. It simply goes poof. In a sense, evil is psychological because it is only detectable in history by people, but God turns evil into good in his kingdom.
I'm reading the question too. Okay, so it turns, yeah, okay, so I want to be very nuanced here. Do you want me to answer that question? You want me to sort of like, okay, so,
Yeah, I think it was
yeah,
directed to
oh
you,
yeah, yeah. So
Tommy.
I want to be
Yeah.
very nuanced here. So I don't know if what I'm trying to imagine is not God turning evil into good. Evil is a fact that you can't take back, a fact that not even God can deny occurred, right? I mean, this is one of the points I think that Ivan is trying to get across in the rebellion piece of the Brothers Karamazov right before the Grand Inquisitor. The whole thing is the Grand Inquisitor, but where Ivan is basically saying that I don't want to betray the facts, right? He goes, I don't want to understand. I don't want to betray the fact because in understanding, I betray the fact. In other words, if you try to figure out the cause of evil, where evil is coming from, how God and evil can exist, if you're theorizing about evil, you're trying to understand it, and when you understand it, you're almost trying to eliminate it as a fact of history. So evil is evil, and there's judgment, and judgment is final. But I keep saying this over and over again. I'm trying to frame it not so much that God turns evil into good, but evil is not decisive. And that even something new can emerge from evil, something constructive, something creative, something restorative, something reconciliatory, something even intimate. And I just I wouldn't say it that way, that aha, God has made something good out of evil. I would just simply say that something has emerged through evil. And I know it's a subtle difference, and maybe I'm being nitpicky here, but the way I'm saying it still recognizes the fact that it occurred and a judgment has been made on it. Does that make sense? You seem skeptical, Jack.
No, I'm with you. I'm
I
with you.
think that the poof
No,
is
I think
really
that's a
the
good answer.
thing.
Huh?
This word goes poof is the issue I think we're having, not necessarily with the question. Masha, this isn't directed at you. It's actually that Zizioulas, I think, is sort of framing it as like a magic trick in that way. Like you said, as like a sort of like sci-fi device, right? Like the memory just disappears. And I think what we're trying to say is that there is no way of, even when all of life is transformed, right? Like even when the resurrection has happened, the not only are the wounds still there, but also the things that happen, even for the good from that, are still part and parcel with the memory. There's no poof that's happening. I think we're critiquing that sort of
Right.
element.
If there's no memory, then the memory is irredeemable or unredeemed. And I think that's right. Um, the so to kind of I think pivot to where we were kind of going,
Right.
I was going to bring up I think um, some of the tensions here that I think are worth kind of commenting on a bit. I think that the real strengths of this chapter kind of turn on the way in which um, Zizioulas kind of ironically articulates an experiential, I don't want to say psychological, but let's say a phenomenological or existential approach to understanding hell and judgment. This extrication of hell and judgment from the language of, arbitrary punishment or, the Sistine Chapel uh, Last Judgment kind of image of God dividing up people and putting other, the juridical legal approach, and articulating instead what it would mean to think through judgment in relational existential terms. And what he arrives at, I think, a picture of hell as this anti-relational, isolationist, individual, unreciprocated, kind of torment of one's own making. I think that that's a very, I think he's right about that. And I think that's a very kind of rich way to approach, right? If heaven is communion, so to speak, and hell is no communion, it's isolation. Um, I think that does a lot of work here that um, I will say does not get teased out, I think, as consistently as it might. So, um, those strengths, I think, run up against his honestly somewhat surprising, insistent kind of point over and over again on preserving the idea of the eternity of hell. There's been kind of a lot of work over the last couple of years and within Orthodox theology for a long time, I think, to critique the idea of the eternity of hell. And this book, in some ways, is a not so subtle pushback against that direction. And what I think is kind of interesting about this or surprising about it is it seems to cut against the grain of everything we've been talking about up to this point. It's almost it's the opposite direction from his insistence on the erasure of all memory of suffering and sin. That will be forgotten and gone, and yet there will be an eternal hell. Seems to be the two sides of the chapter being argued here. And I'm not really sure how he reconciles both of these claims. But I think also his arguments for the eternity of hell should be looked at a little bit more closely on their own terms, because I'm not sure they're as compelling as he seems to think they are, frankly. Um, Now, the kind of three that I'm going to just kind of think of the top of my head is he makes kind of the claim that um, hell as this relational or anti-relational reality cannot be overcome or negated because freedom cannot be overcome or negated, right? As long as the creature is unwilling to be in relation to God, it has to remain out of relation. It can see communion, but it doesn't want it. It can't have it. It refuses it. But this argument about the non-being of evil, right? The nothingness of evil seems to undermine, I think, his insistence on the persistence of the preference for non-being over the being of communion.
Right.
I'm not sure how we can just simply insist that the freedom of the creature is kind of like a Frankenstein's monster sort of thing, and God is unable to reconcile his own creation to himself.
Right.
Um, and to kind of make this point, he brings up also the distinction between God's eternity and the kind of becoming of created being, right? He says created being, which has a beginning and a terminus
Mhm.
from God and to God, even when reconciled to God, even after the eschaton, is in motion. And so you cannot have a final sort of reconciliation without undermining creative freedom. What I think is kind of interesting about this point, though, is that once again, I think we could make precisely the same argument, but in the other direction against the eternity of hell, which is if God's eternity is eternal and created being is always in a state of becoming, it seems to me at least that you could make the case that uh, our becoming being can still be reconciled to the eternal being of God because it can't forever outrun the source and the finality of its own createdness,
Mm.
right? How can a finite being simply resist infinite communion? It seems at least plausible that you could say that, well, eventually you don't need to just simply say that God imposes reconciliation on creatures, but that creatures, because of their createdness, can be purified even after death in such a way that they eventually will what God wills, that they eventually overcome their own kind of inertia, their own kind of resistance to love,
And that's one
because
way.
love is more real
Yeah,
than non-love, than
right.
right?
Right. Because he has a line in here, and I don't remember to where, but he has a line in here that um, what's done basically what's done is done, right? There's no chance after death um to really undo what's done. Um,
Right.
and I can't find it. But
I'll look.
um
It's at the end. It's toward
I
the
mean
end of the chapter.
I know it's here, right? But I know it's here that he basically says that what's done is done. Um, but so yeah, I mean, I just maybe kind of speak to some of the points you say, Jack, in a way that's kind of the same too. I mean, basically, um, he's presupposing that he's presupposing that basically that people who want to argue that there's no hell. Well, I'm sorry, let me back up. He's arguing that people who argue that everyone will be saved because they can't imagine the God of love ultimately not really doing whatever God can to bring everything into salvation, bring everything into reconciliation. He's saying that these people think that there's no hell, and if there's no hell, there's no judgment and there's no justice.
Hmm.
And he references Bulgakov for that. And that's wrong. I mean, that's wrong. That's clearly wrong. That's Bulgakov doesn't say that at all. Um, Bulgakov does believe all will be saved, but Bulgakov also says that there has to be judgment and justice in another life. That there has to be that.
Yeah.
And I personally think that that forgiveness is the only human experience in which justice and love actually come together. When there's actual real forgiveness, when there's on two sides, not just when there's actual real forgiveness on two sides, on both sides, is the only time when justice and love can really come together. And so that's the first thing. And I think someone like Bulgakov, and this isn't a defense of Bulgakov, it's just more like this is more of a bringing to light the fact that some of the things Zizioulas is saying about people who argue for what's called universal salvation is not necessarily true. That most of these people would argue that there's something else that's happening after this life, or at least are believing in a God of love and reconciliation. That there's much more to what existing and that death is a passageway into some other kind of form of existence, some form of process, some form of judgment, something. Um,
Yeah, it should be clarified here that nobody here, no one that he's even arguing against is
right,
denying hell.
right.
The
That's what
issue,
is trying to define it. Yeah,
yeah, the issue here is whether hell is ultimately an eternal reality of non-being, of opposition to God, of non-communion, whatever, or if hell is like history
yeah,
itself, right? Something, an ongoing sort of purification of being, right? Something undergone that on the other side is redeemable.
yeah,
And it seems here that, well, I mean, he says that there has to be at least a kind of proviso that allows for a refusal to be redeemed.
yeah,
But this seems to conflict with his insistence that the refusal of communion is non-being, is nothing.
right.
So if nothing can coexist, can co-be alongside reality, well, that seems to in itself sort of conflict with the basic kind of principles that he's laying out here. And it seems like there's a tacit acknowledgement of this even in the chapter because he concludes by maintaining that, you know, pointing out that the church continues to pray
Right,
for
right.
for everyone, regardless of their state of life. And I mean, if we wanted to push further, you know, I think of the kneeling prayers at the Vespers for Pentecost, right? We pray even for the souls in hell explicitly. Now, this sort of, uh, you know, on the Bulgakov, and he brings also, I think, Berdayev and Afanasiev and others. Their side of the argument that saying hell is not eternal, right,
Okay.
is grounded in part by the acknowledgement of how the church prays for those who have died.
Right. Exactly. You could take the memorial service and move it in that direction. Yeah.
And even Zizioulas acknowledges this here in the chapter. He just maintains that uh, we cannot affirm that hell is not eternal because this seems to fly in the face of freedom.
Yeah.
But his own definition of freedom, I would suggest, contradicts this claim. And the fact that he points out that the church seems to hold open, you know, that we pray um, for those that are outside, at least it would seem, of grace or what have you in this life,
Yeah.
is a way of kind of hedging his bet here. Um,
Mhm.
and I just think that it's kind of there are just obvious sort of tensions in his arguments against the eternity of hell on the basis of his own theology.
Yeah.
You could make probably much stronger arguments in the other direction and be more consistent with his overall vision of being as communion.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the question we're raising, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the kind of the question I think that we're trying to maybe explore ways in which this could yeah, be clarified. Right? That I think
Can
is
you talk, Jack, about this section on the ecumenical council? Because I thought you have that's part of this conversation as well.
Well, I think that's an interesting section because he brings up let me see here. Where does he bring that up? I want to actually do justice to the direct quotation. So he brings up the Fifth Ecumenical Council, uh, Constantinople 2, 553. that condemned the teachings of Origen. And it's interesting that he brings this up. He says that the church, this is on page 238, the church has officially rejected the idea of the restoration of all as a false opinion and error. Whenever there has been a synodical condemnation, especially one by an ecumenical council, the reception of the condemned opinion constitutes a heresy. The Fifth Ecumenical Council, following the theology of the Emperor Justinian, condemned, among other things, the Origenian teachings concerning the apokatastasis, that is, universal salvation, and adopted as its own of the 15 canons against Origen of the Home Synod of Constantinople of 543. Consequently, the responses to the questions that are given by ecclesiastical writers relating to the eternity of hell, both on the ground of divine love and on the ontological level, cannot ignore the decisions of the Fifth Ecumenical Council with regard to this matter. So it seems to me, anyway, that he is kind of going against uh, certain elements of his own theology to maintain the eternity of hell by showing deference to this council.
Yeah.
However, I mean, and this is not kind of just kind of me popping off on the top of my head. There's been a lot of scholarship and the history of theology since that council, right,
Mhm.
cuts against the reading of the council that he puts forward here. I mean, it's kind of well known, for example, that that council condemned a certain idea of universalism put forward not even by Origen of Alexandria himself, but by certain disciples of Origen, so-called Origenists,
Yeah.
right, who held that the soul pre-exists the body and that you kind of have an infinite cycle of possible creations and salvation and what have you. And these doctrines are condemned. It's noteworthy that other Universalist authors that Zizioulas even mentions explicitly in the text, like St. Gregory of Nyssa, rejected the Origenist view of the pre-existence of souls, which I don't really want to get into the details on that. That's a thing unto itself. But Gregory of Nyssa was a Universalist and did not hold the Origenist position and is not condemned by the council. So the question is the council condemning universalism, universal salvation, or is it condemning a certain iteration of universal salvation articulated by a certain group of monks uh, in Syria and Palestine?
Yeah.
And the a great deal of scholarship has shown that it's the latter. In fact, I mean, it's and Zizioulas admits this. Even the majority of readers of Maximus the Confessor maintain that Maximus's theology is universalist, while not positing the doctrine of pre-existence that was condemned at the council, which neither did Gregory. So this whole kind of history of universalist theology in Orthodoxy is not Origenist in character at all, and to conflate them is not entirely uh, not entirely fair to the position he's critiquing.
Mm-hmm.
We should get to the last chapter, but
Yeah,
the last thing on this point, the thing that I want to maybe raise is this. We had this debate about universal salvation versus hell or whatever, and I often wonder sometimes what's the point? Because it still frames the importance of Christian life as something that happens later. And is with a book that talks about the eschaton and the possibility of the eschaton breaking into history. And if the eschaton is communion and communion and otherness and theosis and all that, then why think about it? I mean, why not just think about the now, right? In other words, there's a way of talking about how there's the way of talking about hellish existence in the now, right? There's a way of talking
oh,
about
definitely. Yeah.
hellish existence as lack of communion, as absence of love, as being being taken over by drugs and addiction, and how that tears families apart, because your body somehow is, you're not in control of your body and other things. Demonic possession in that sense, right? Right? Like literally drug addiction is a kind of demonic possession in the sense that the demonic is the, you know, the breaking of communion. Um, Challenging Sartre in the sense that hell is the other, and maybe kind of nuancing that hell really is the absence of the loving other. Um, Hell could be the other if the other is, a Nazi. Yeah. Um, as one example. Um, I don't know.
Or if you're incapable of love. Yeah.
Well, I'm just, all these eschatological categories, in my opinion, would be better served by transposing them to our present and current existence, right? To amplify what it means, to live in hell now, right? Um, there's plenty of examples of that. You know,
Yeah.
there's, and especially trying to make sense of what happens. Even the Matthew 25 is about, what have you done now, right?
Yeah.
How have you related now? And there's a sense in which, however we're relating now, I mean, there'll be some kind of continuation of that in some form of life after death. And then, and that from there, it's, I, it's hard to imagine that whatever we're experiencing now is really the only dimension of reality that is there, right? I mean, I'm sure people in the ancient world thought, that they could never imagine, human beings flying in the sky. So, I don't know. I wonder why we're even having this discussion.
Yeah.
Because it constantly frames everything, the importance of Christianity as a kind of after death thing.
Well, I don't know if it's only after death. I think it's the fact of death bearing on to like, and then for him the fact of the resurrection. So not, I think after is maybe not quite the right way that he's understanding that. Um, but I think a perfect example in this chapter of what you're talking about is his like really weird obsession in a couple of the sections
Right.
about whether Satan and the demons will be saved. And I was like, I'm not thinking about them.
Right.
That's just from a
Well,
spiritual perspective, like not to
well,
even be an
in
academic.
fairness, that
Yeah.
was condemned at the aforementioned
Yeah,
council.
but listen,
So,
from just giving, I'm not giving anyone spiritual advice. You do what you want. I'm gonna do my cross. I don't think about demons. You know why? Because even if I thought that they'd get saved and then I'm not holy enough to pray for them without being tempted myself, I leave them alone. God will do what God wants to do. That'll get figured out. Maybe some saints are in there, whatever. But I'm not. I'm not. So why do I need to be right? To me, maybe it's just indicative that Zizioulas had achieved such a state of being close to theosis that he could think about this. But I think in my lifetime, I will never write about whether demons are saved because I am just not even in a place to pray for them. And this is like probably sounds off the rails for people who maybe aren't Orthodox, but this is a very common Orthodox line of thought is like, don't even think about them right now. And the reason I bring this up is that like that is such a question that is just so out there in terms of to me philosophy, in terms of also just so far into the eschaton of like whatever that phrase could mean, right? Insert caveats about time, duration, whatever. Like that, why are we discussing this? To me, I think it's important to think about what vision of reality now does something like Zizioulas give us versus for me, someone like Bulgakov, or even I'm surprised he doesn't once cite or look at David Bentley Hart and any of his work on universal
I was
salvation.
surprised by that too. Yeah.
It feels like that I don't know what's going on there, but that's okay. And it just feels like there is such potential here to think about the like the practices of reconciliation, what are the practices of the eschaton in light of a vision of hell, in light of a vision of salvation? And he starts to get to that. And I'm bringing this up because I think it segues into liturgy in the last chapter. But he does kind of start to get to this, on 244, where he says, nobody is saved alone. You know, indeed, the more one is anxious about one's own salvation alone, the more one distances oneself from it and submits to the quote unquote powers of Satan, right? I think that these conversations, at least where I'm at spiritually, where I think like I'm not more spiritually capable than most people. I'm probably less spiritually capable than most people. Where I'm at is that like thinking about it, like that an orientation to a future where all can be reconciled to God, an orientation where I live as though reconciliation can happen, to me should mean that I live that out in the actual practices, in the actual quote unquote work of the people, me as a person in the body of Christ today. And to me, at least, where I end up to answer Barbara's question is I think that that's stronger if I at least have the hope that all can be reconciled and live that out today in a reconciliatory way.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, in other words, that's when you were talking about, what you're going to do now and all that. I mean, that's a remembering of the future, right? And that's a real powerful way in which that remembering of the future shapes the current moment. So he's right about that.
Yeah.
But all these theologians, I think, just engage in this detailed explanation of what's going to occur after
Yeah,
death.
just
And I
leave it.
don't really
Well,
know, I don't really know, like, I mean, I like what you say, Richard, like the living with the hope of reconciliation, but ultimately, in some sense, focusing our energies on how that eschaton can inbreak now through various kinds of practices, through the liturgical event, which is the last chapter. I mean, and he's right about that. There is a sense in which when we gather together to really worship, recognize, not judge, recognize, accept people for who they are, um, put everything, as the Cherubic hymn says, put all our cares aside so that we may receive the King of all. I mean, that's a political statement, actually, so that we may receive the King of all. Um, yeah, I mean, I think, and you offer the bread and the wine, simple elements, for transfiguration, which is the feast day for today. Yeah, that's eschatological. I agree with that. I agree with that's the eschaton breaking in. But there's other ways in which the eschaton can break in. And so he's right about that. I just don't, and it's hellish when we make choices and decisions or are captured in situations where we have no choice or decision and have to live with what people are doing to us,
hmm
right? Through various forms of violence and other things. Yeah, there's plenty of hell on earth to think about. Um, I don't know what theologically is gained by this kind of reflection, because it takes our eye off the ball. I think it still kind of makes us think that what's important about Christianity is what comes after death. And not to mention the fact that it tends to simplify sin. We know now more than ever that sin is really complicated. People have a lot of different kinds of psychological conditions and makes-ups. There's various kinds of spectrums of all kinds and whatever. And I don't know. I'm not saying there's no sin. I'm not. There is sin, but sin is complicated. I think it's not as if in fact God has set things up in such a way that God has to decide who goes there and who goes here, then I don't envy God at all because that's going to be a really tough decision. And where do you draw the line? And in what way and how? And what do you take into account? And you to take count genetics. Do you take account family history, nature, where you're planted in history, geography,
Systems,
every systems. Yeah, thank you, Rich.
right? I can't buy a piece of clothing
Right,
without contributing to a system of oppression.
right, right. So
And I'm
exactly.
not allowed to walk outside naked. So
So I just think that it's this whole debate somehow takes us
Well,
far afield. Sorry, we might be getting far
no,
from Zizioulas itself, but
no, I want to push back really quick on his behalf,
all right.
on this point at least,
Okay.
because
Yep.
um now if it's about detail, these sort of, I don't know, Baroque speculative eschatologies is one thing, and I think that that's all. I don't know. Those tend to be a little incredible to me from
Yeah.
a theologically honest standpoint as a human being that's living in the world and going to die. But I think the eschatological emphasis on reconciliation and the scope of the saving act of Christ in and beyond history, I think the value in this is exactly what you're saying, is that when we ask about the scope of God's love and the comprehensiveness of creation's reconciliation with him, we're asking the question of, well, what does the resurrection mean for me right now? And I think the debates over the eternity of hell, universalism, are debates about what the resurrection means now. And
Okay.
I think um, the concrete what this means for me now, Zizioulas articulates maybe better than anybody else that we glimpse this, we live this in the Eucharistic mystery, right?
Yeah.
That there is something temporal, lived, real in communion, experienced in the liturgy that has implications for, or should and must, if we believe them, if they are what we take them to be, those have implications for the totality of human existence.
Hmm.
But the significance of that event of communion, of being as communion,
Yeah.
to some degree, I think it compels us to raise the question of, I mean, not to be kind of trite about it, does love win? Does redemption, does reconciliation, does communion win? And I think raising that question, there's all kinds of ways where you can raise that question wrongly, in a way that's about skipping to the end,
Yeah.
that's about ignoring the complexity of sin and evil. But raised rightly, it becomes a question that holds up exactly what you just said about, I mean, frankly, the absurdity of a God that is just electing one group and condemning another. That's not the God that was, died and resurrected for us. The God that died and resurrected for us is the God that knows no distance that is too great to, separate us from his love, right? So if we take that up as the guiding way, the lens through which we look at the resurrection, I think that has implications for, and the most fundamental implications of that faith, of that trust, are for now. It's not about, well, am I going to be okay? It's about, well, what does
Right.
that mean for me and you and we here?
Okay.
And that's a kind of my take on,
yeah.
and I do see a tension between elements of what is articulated in the penultimate chapter and the Eucharistic vision of the
Last chapter.
future that gets articulated in the last chapter and in the all the chapters we read up to that point,
Yeah.
which is about the triumph of the resurrection. And I think, I don't know, but I do very much, I mean, I agree that theology should be about
Now,
here, now.
but
Um,
you're saying that there's a debate about what's called universal salvation, salvation for all people, is about the now.
or should be about the now. I think there's ways that it might not be, you
And
know, there are
it can veer off, yeah.
yeah, but I do think that ultimately the stakes and the reason why people get so mad about it online or whatever
Mm.
are because the real stakes are actually more about now than later.
Mm.
And I think there's all kinds of ways that they are the question of what it means, you know, is the Eucharist it? Is that what it means to be?
Yeah. Okay.
You know?
Yeah. Well, we have 15 minutes left, and I think we covered a lot of the bases
Heaven,
of
hell.
heaven, hell, and everything. And I want to give it to the ones who have joined us today. Maybe a chance for some tie-up questions here. I mean, I will say maybe just to get a little bit of Zizioulas nerdy here. What he says in the last chapter, yeah, what he says in the last chapter is stuff that pretty much he's been writing about since the beginning of his career. Um, it's the chapter I think that has the least what might call new stuff to find in Zizioulas.
Mm.
There is a page though where he says, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to I don't mean to kind of keep obsessing about this point, but on page 309, he talks about forgiveness, right? Forgiveness of sins. What happens is forgiveness is a liberation from the past." And then further down, but forgiveness seeks to destroy the concept of facticity. Okay, so for the second point is absolutely wrong. I mean, let's just say that very clearly. Okay. Um, the first point needs to be nuanced. What does liberation from the past mean, right?
Yeah.
I'm willing to agree with that point as long as we're clear about the word liberation. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is a liberation to not have an evil that is done. Either you're the cause of the evil or the victim of the evil. There is a kind of liberation where that evil doesn't rule your life anymore. And, you know, we tend to think, especially with violence, that it's kind of a one-time thing, right? So you get mugged on the street and you're hit over the head with a pipe and you wind up being fine and but people think that okay, well they should be fine. Now, they didn't die. But everybody knows now that that kind of event can linger very much in trauma, right? Or even if you have an accident that it might lead to, you know, probable death or something like that. I mean, those are traumatic events, both evil in some way, because they involve death. And I think the Zulus would agree. I mean, those can linger. They don't necessarily linger, but they can linger. And um, so yeah, I mean, I think there's a liberation. That liberation can occur when events like that and other kinds of events that we can think about, like war and other things, don't dominate your life, right? But if liberation from the past means here, again, like what we saw before, a removal, no, a destroying of facticity or a removal of memory, then I don't think that that's correct. I don't
Mm.
that doesn't quite fit, I think. So, anyway, we're back to the point I keep harping on, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, I think that there's concepts that, so within this chapter, we have a really robust and beautiful understanding of what liturgy is, which is not how I always experience it. Sometimes I just experience it as going to church, being a little distracted,
right.
and leaving, right? And he has this beautiful, robust understanding that I should keep to heart when I go to liturgy. Of of a community that's the pre or that's living in some way eschatologically in future time. And I guess what I'm wondering or kind of thinking with Zizioulas is I think there's concepts that actually come out from communities who have to engage in really deep systemic forgiveness that could help this chapter. So, concepts I'm thinking of are beloved community, concepts like transformative justice. Um,
Right.
I was sharing with someone like there's this book called Beyond Survival: Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. And for those unfamiliar, TJ basically says that when harm is done in the community solves that harm together. And it's not a punishment-based system. And in one of the stories in this book, there's a guy who's been sexually harassing like all his women underneath him. He's an executive director. And the community decided together, we don't want to kick him out of the community, but we want to put safeguards in place to not allow him to re-victimize people. We want to acknowledge the harm that was done, and we want to move forward and give the people who were harmed, the women who were harmed, control of how this gets dealt with in our community. I think that's a really beautiful example of actually what I think could be kind of sacramental. There's something about the inbreaking of like a radical forgiveness that isn't just punishment oriented, right? And so I think if liturgy is meant to be this example par excellence, right, of what he's talking about, I think we that it could help Zizioulas to think with different communities that are also coming up with these kinds of practices that I think are inbreakings. I think about also like in liberation theology, the base communities, the conversations they're having about their own situation and what it means to move forward in their lives, right? And what it means to have a relationship with God in light of this, right? So I don't know, I think that there's still that glimmer of something really beautiful here, and he might need some assistance from some of these other groups to think with him.
I mean, it could be an expansion of the Eucharistic to those other kinds of groups, perhaps, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's
Yeah, I agree with that.
the way of thinking about it. Well, I never really let class out early, and when I have class,
Do we have any last minute questions from folks?
any last minute questions from anybody? Um,
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like how does he, maybe he does. I read this chapter too far ago. And didn't have time to fully reread it. Um, how does he account for other options besides the liturgy, the Orthodox liturgy?
he's not good at that. I have to be honest. I mean,
It's a good
he
question. Yeah.
he is a good question. I mean, obviously, I mean, I think he'll see value in other groups kind of doing the kind of work that you're talking about, transformative justice especially. Um, but he's very, very suspicious of in parishes having separate groups like women's groups or youth groups or disability groups or whatever.
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah.
Very, very suspicious of that because he feels everybody should come together in the Eucharist.
Hmm.
I mean, yes and no, though,
I
Rachel.
even mean that was like a Catholic.
Yeah, but
What,
yes.
what's the
Well, yes.
Catholic liturgy? What Lutherans are doing on Sunday? Is
Well, I
you
mean,
know what I mean?
well,
Like
no, he has like
even broader
theological,
than that.
no, he has theological works where he was part of the ecumenical movement and
Yeah.
probably really responsible in many ways of carrying through the importance of the Eucharist in ways that impacted the ecumenical movement. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, one of the things, just to give our followers here, the people who are following us, a little bit of historical context. I mean, Zizioulas is drawing off a tradition in the 20th century that really tried to um, kind of revive, I would say, the importance of the Eucharist as a communal event, right? Not just as an individual thing you do for your salvation and for your spiritual nourishment or whatever, but as a real human, as a real Eucharistic, as a real communal event. And he's a big proponent of what's called Eucharistic ecclesiology. In other words, understanding, like, when you ask the question, where is the church? You point to the Eucharist. You don't point to the metropolis, or you don't point necessarily to the parish building. You don't point to the Patriarchate or the, Vatican. You point to the Eucharist taking place, no matter where it is, whether it can be in South Dakota or, Rome or wherever. Um, and there's something of real insight in that tradition in this, and Zizioulas is bringing that forward. I mean, one of the things that may be a little bit confusing to the people again here that don't necessarily have a theological background is this idea of how remembering the future, of making the future present. And I kind of said this in the first session, but I want to say it again, is that just be careful about just be careful about hardening your sense of time, right? Time is not as simple as past, present, future. Um, Again, time is not as simple as past, present, future, right? So I'll give you, like, I said this example in the first session. I want to say it again. We have what's called a Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. When I went, I'm not sure if it's still there. There was a kind of a passageway, brick passageway from one exhibit to another. And in this passageway, it was tall ceilings and there were black and white pictures everywhere. And obviously, the Holocaust Museum is constructed in such a way as to make you feel as if you're there. Obviously, you're not there, but it's constructed in a way to bring the past into the present. Okay, so that when you walk out, you're disturbed. They don't want you to walk out saying, "Oh, I have all this cognitive knowledge in my head now, that I can bring up at the dinner table." Right? They want you to feel disturbed. And so if you walk through this hall of pictures and see all these black white photos with no writing underneath, you know exactly what it's about. It's families that were lost in the Holocaust.
Hmm.
Very moving. It's very powerful. The past becomes present. And if you take that same picture and, drop it in the street of New York with no context, no nothing, and you pick it up, you're not going to have the same literally experience, not feeling, but you're not going to have the same experience. The past will not enter into the present. It will not if you find this picture on the street. And so Zizioulas is right in the sense that what he's basically trying to get at is that we can have that same relationship to the future. And how? Because Christ is the future, literally, literally. And so the point is that how do we create symbols and language and structures and systems, right? Where when we walk in and through them, and music and art and poetry, right? So that when we walk kind of in and through those things, the future is bursting in, right? Um, and he's right. We should end there. That's one of his basic insights that he's correct about. I mean, if you really believe in God
Yeah.
and Jesus Christ, and he said right in the beginning, I'm not here to convince anybody. I'm here to write to people who already believe in Jesus. Jesus is the future. And that's the great mystery. That's what we believe in. And it could impact our now, our present, who we are, what we become, how we relate to each other. Again, that experience of the Holocaust Museum, and I can think of other examples as well. I mean, there's a way in which we can really have a real presence of someone, of an event, of a person through material forms, through letter writing, through pictures, through all kinds of things, especially given the right kind of context, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then as Christians believing in the incarnation of Jesus and the resurrection, yeah, I mean, there's can be a remembrance of the future. And I think also he's right that whatever that remembrance of the future, the only conceptual way to fully make sense of it is in ontological terms. I think he's correct about that too. Now,
Yeah.
might we quibble on some of the details that he's trying to explore here? Sure. No theologian ever gets it exactly right. Even the saints, no theologian ever gets it exactly right. But that's the great value of any theologian, is that they help you keep thinking about it. And there's absolutely no question that Zizioulas has done that here in this book. No
Totally.
question.
Yeah.
He's one of the great theologians, not simply of the 20th century, but in the history of Orthodox theology.
Without question. Yeah.
Again, we might quibble, but he's like one of the great theologians. And we're grateful for what he's done and for his contribution and what he's offered to us. So, and we miss him. You know, we miss him. We miss his presence. And well, yeah, I guess I'm kind of proving my point here. I guess
Yeah.
we're doing exactly what he's here. He's here with us now. He's present with us. He's around and about, and we're continuing to think with him. And yeah, and now he has a bird's eye view of what he was trying to talk about.
The future.
Right. So,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you all for joining us.
Oh, that was really beautiful.
Thank you, Jack and Rachel.
Thank you for
You
having me.
guys
It
were
was
awesome.
great.
Having us.
Yeah. Thank you both. It was fantastic.
Thank you everyone for your awesome questions and interactions.
Definitely.
Visit our center, visit Public Orthodoxy. Make sure you like all the things on our social networks and YouTube and everything, and increase the algorithm there. And anyway, thank you all very much. I'm going to miss these conversations, but maybe we'll do this again in some other form. So, all right, everybody, take care. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Blessed
Bye.
feast day.